Today we will be painting a tree with a beard. Let's go! So yes, we are painting wood today. One method is to just spray it brown and then dry brush it cream or grey. It might look okay, and that's all you may need to do. But that won't make a fun video. So we are going to make him a touch more detailed than that by using some simple techniques. The model was prepared today first with a matte black spray paint. And then grey was applied all over this using a makeup brush. This was done in a couple of layers. You will notice that some of the darker shaded areas remain black. This is for the deeper looking shadows and crevices of the sculpt. Once all of the grey had been added, a further layer of Banshee brown was applied to the miniature also. This is to make some of the areas a little bit lighter. The way that we are using this initial makeup brush layer is similar to what we do with a dry brushing technique. However, the paint is still damp as we apply it to the miniature. A little tip here, to get excess paint off your brush instead of using a tissue, as you can get these annoying little bits of paper in your bristles, which is not what you want whilst painting, I like to use a sponge instead. And with a circular motion, you can see the paint build up in layers onto the miniature fairly quickly. The upper parts of the miniature is where you want to focus most of your efforts here, leaving the darker areas underneath in the recesses. This is to mimic where natural light would hit the model from above. So now we can have fun and put some colours onto the miniature. Cue speed paints. Firstly, palette bone was mixed with some medium, around about a 50-50 mix. The medium here is used to thin down our coloured paint to make it more translucent, which will enable us to see the darker and lighter tones underneath that we painted in our previous stage. A monster brush was used for this as it's slightly larger in size, and it won't take long to paint the miniature. Now, I say you can't really go wrong here. You don't need to worry about being messy, we are literally applying it onto the bark. It doesn't matter too much if you find any of the paint going into the recesses here, as we will focus on these darker areas later on. So, we have covered the bark with our first colour, and now we are going to add some other tones to the surface to give it a more organic, natural feel. Hardened leather with medium was the next colour of choice, and this was applied mainly in the recesses to darken them down a bit. But also some paint was added onto the top areas and then blended out with a makeup brush. This smooths out the edges where the paint sits and starts producing a nice gradient to the previous layer. Now the parts of this sculpt which I thought were quite clever were these inner wooden areas. They kind of look like muscles, which is quite fitting for a moving, humanistic looking tree. And so these areas were picked out with hardened leather. No medium was used here, just to keep the paint quite dark, to make the overall miniature look a bit more interesting. The exposed wooden rings where you can see the cross section of these were also picked out. And finally for the face. The hardened leather was used to darken down the facial features and give our old tree some shape. Once we have finished with our second speed paint layer, we should end up with something like this. With trees being a plethora of colours from greys, browns, creams and greens to name a few, it was fitting to add some green areas towards the bottom part of the legs and feet. This is just to add some colour, and it could represent a build-up of moss over the years. With the slightly translucent properties of speed paints mixed with medium, we can get some nice looking tones relatively quickly, and it's a fun way of painting. So, whilst you're watching me paint, and you're thinking, gee willikers, I need some Ents in my life, well fear not, unless you're Saruman and 𝐷𝐼𝐴 of course. You could get them plus a whole range of Middle-earth miniatures and hobby products at Artillery Games, who are wonderfully sponsoring this video today. And the best thing is, you could get things at a discounted price. So check them out and show them some love by using the link in the description below. Now, back to our beardy friend. We are going to add some further depth to the miniature by applying some Gravelord Grey into the shaded areas and crevices. This is going to darken down the shadows even more and really start to make the most out of this fine sculpt. However, this time we have switched over to a smaller, finer tipped brush, The paint was also used for the inner wooden muscle areas, just to help separate them out from the surrounding bark. It should also be said at this point that the colours used today would actually be pretty cool for some stone and rock when you do some scenery. But probably not with this ent, otherwise it will be difficult to decipher what is what. So the rock that he is holding will be grey. Finally, just a quick whiz over the beard with a larger brush to create some darker areas was achieved. At this stage, the wooden areas are perfectly fine for the gaming table. We have some nice colours on there and some depth to our shadows. But if you are anything like me, you will want to push this a bit further. So let's continue. Using our trusty makeup brush, Monster Brown was added to some of the outer sections of our bark. We don't need to be too precise, just be a bit random in your placement here. I think this model has been the most fun to paint in the collection so far. I'm not really thinking about it, and I'm just letting my imagination flow on this one. It just makes a really fun and exciting project. The question of the day would be, have you guys worked on anything that makes you feel like that lately? It would be interesting to see the comments on this one. Afterwards, the same technique was used with Banshee Brown. However, only a few of the uppermost parts of Treebeard were painted, just to represent the light hitting the tree. Using the makeup brush with the last two colours didn't take too long at all, and it just lifts some of these areas nicely to bring out more of the details of the sculpt. Now, let's add some interest to the miniature with a spot of colour. Commando green was used to pick out the mossy deposits on the sculpt. This bobbly texture can mainly be seen on the feet and the beard. To make this moss more vibrant looking, a couple of layers were prodded on with a brush. Firstly, on the left some goblin green was used, and then followed up by hemp rope on the right. And if you were a fantasy Skaven player, this could be a pretty cool technique for a warpstone glow effect. Emphasizing the inner wood sections was done with a fine detail brush. Monster Brown was added to highlight the ridges and create a series of lines. This really brought out some extra detail to the sculpt, and the same was done to pick out the rings also. So a little bit of patience here whilst painting these details can go a long way. For the mushrooms, they could be painted in so many different ways because there are hundreds of varieties. I opted for a yellowy colour here, just to make it stand out over the grey and brown tones of our bark. With these small details now being picked out, you can start to see our Treebeard really come together. We used the same colours for the beard as we did for the main bark section, but remember we did add more Gravelord Grey to sink in between the recesses. Now we will use some combat fatigues and a dry brush method to layer up a lighter colour. The bristles will glide over the surface and pick out the details of the beard. The more you dry brush, the lighter it will seem. Now, to make him come to life by painting his eyes. A yellow was put down as a base coat to pick out the initial shape, and afterwards a black dot was painted on to form a pupil. To take it one step further, a small white dot was painted in the same place for both eyes. For instance, the top right area of the pupil to give it a shiny reflective detail of our ent. As this is a pretty large model, we would like to focus the eye to the details on the front, such as the beard section. So the ivy was painted next, and this was done with a darker green than our moss earlier. To break up the visual elements of the miniature, the highlights were also different to the moss colours, and they were done with a more bluey toned green. This will help the eye easily distinguish between the different elements of this busy looking beard. The final highlight was done with a fine detailed brush, just to give it a thin, sharp looking line. Now for the most important character that you will paint in any Entmoot army, and that is Samantha the Snail. She has travelled to all sorts of places with Treebeard. Her most memorable endeavours was the squashing of the orcs at Isengard, and she was also Treebeard's wing woman when he was looking for the Entwives, but sadly to no avail. True story. And now to the leaves. They were given a different green colour to the moss and the ivy. Again, this is to break up the different elements of the miniature. This was followed by a shade and a highlight. It's noting here that the leaves could be any colour really, as there are so many varieties of trees. Just look outside for some inspiration. You can, if you like to torture yourself just like me, do a secondary highlight on all of the leaves, with a bright punchy green such as Poisonous Cloud. This will really make those individual leaves pop with a sharper, crispy highlight. For the stone, I wanted it to be as if Treebeard ripped it out of the ground, so they are not going to be pretty and clean, but a bit worn and weathered. After the initial base coat of uniform grey, military shader was applied to the whole thing. The drying time was speeded up by using a hairdryer, and because this paint was heated and dried so quickly, some small cracks appeared, which I thought was quite a nice touch, even if this was done by accident. Afterwards, a 𝗪𝗡 looking brush with a small amount of watered down paint in the bristles was used to pat on the next couple of colours. This method was done to achieve an uneven, layered paint look. You don't need to cover absolutely everything here, just let some of the green show through and build up the colour to your desired effect. You can also enhance some of the cracks in the sculpt by applying a highlight with the stone golem paint. Then afterwards, some dark tone was added between the rock and the branch fingers to separate the two different materials. This latter technique is a good one to use for any miniature. However, sometimes watering down a black paint may be even better for this, as it will have a more refined look, as you see in many of my other videos. And because Treebeard is such an iconic character, we can make him stand out on the battlefield even more by applying some highlights to the bark. This was done with a brighter colour such as combat fatigues. Now you can skip this stage if you like, as you may be happy with the standard that he is currently in. Sometimes it's harder to say that will do and move on to the next project, rather than adding more and more details and highlights. Sometimes it's a balance, and sometimes it's what time you may have to give. But for this video, I like to give that little bit extra so that you can have that choice to see what may work for you. And speaking of extra elements, some PVA glue was dotted onto the mossy areas and then some green flocked was sprinkled on to give some extra texture. Treebeard, Samantha and the hobbits are now ready for their next adventure together. And if you want to know how these forest bases were created, then you can check out this video right here. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on hobbying.